On January 1942, while jubilant shouts of victory echoed through the streets of Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto instructed the combined Imperial fleet staff to begin preparations for the second phase of military operations in the Pacific. Having reviewed the status reports from the Philippines, Malaya, and the southern regions, he concluded that Japanese forces would establish control over East Asia and other territories attacked in December within just a few months. Therefore, Yamamoto directed his chief of staff, Matomu Gaki, to finalize the plans by mid-February. On the 5th of January 1942, as exultant shouts of victory resounded in the streets of Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto instructed the staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet to begin preparing for the second stage of operations in the Pacific War. His study of the situation reports on the Philippines, Malaya, and points south indicated that Japanese troops in a few months would be in control of East Asia and the other areas they had attacked in December. So Yamamoto told his chief of staff, Matomu Gaki, that he wanted the plans to be completed by the middle of February. The speed with which Japan had conquered the Western Pacific astounded the military planners in Tokyo and caused sharp disagreements within the Imperial General Headquarters, IGH. Fervent military nationalists urged the offensive to continue while Japan was winning, regardless of how far such planning might lead. The other group, represented by Admiral Yamamoto, had been unenthusiastic about starting a war with the United States and Great Britain in the first place and felt anxious about the future. One of the reasons Yamamoto was at sea aboard the Yamato, the flagship of the combined fleet, was that his friends within the IGH feared he might be assassinated if he remained in Tokyo due to his public opposition to an unlimited war. Even now, his opinions were no secret to those around him. His chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki, recorded in his diary the need for far-sighted state wisdom after this first month of glorious victory. These were words Yamamoto often used, warning that Japan could not fight a war with the Western powers and hope to win in the long run. Yamamoto's open criticism of the politicians was directed at Prince Konoye and others, who in his view did not understand the nature of the war Japan had to fight in the Pacific. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had met with his friend Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the ultra-nationalist organization Kokusai-do, at the Imperial Naval Club in Chiba. Yamamoto, warning his friend about the inevitable war due to the politicians' decisions, said that "We will do well at the start. We will stretch out like an octopus releasing its tentacles." And now, just a month into the war, this octopus was almost fully extended. However, Yamamoto also cautioned his longtime friend that the euphoria could not last forever. He believed the time for political action would come with the fall of Singapore. This catastrophe would cause discontent among the British in India, and they would undoubtedly be ready to negotiate for peace. Yamamoto knew the British well. He had been a member of the delegations to the London naval conferences in 1930 and 1934. He also knew the Americans well, having served as Japan's naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He agreed, since the war had been started by the politicians, a major victory had to be achieved quickly. But once that victory was won, Japan would, in his opinion, only have a year and a half to enjoy the triumph. "We must conclude a peace agreement by that time," he told his old friend, and charged his old friend with the mission of conveying this message among the right-wing political leaders in power.
On January 5th, victory seemed close at hand. The U.S. battleship fleet was disabled at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. The British battleships, the Repulse and the Prince of Wales, were sunk off the coast of Malaya. In the Philippines, Manila and the United States naval base at Cavite had been captured. The British had surrendered at Hong Kong, and Japanese forces were already moving toward new landing sites in the Dutch East Indies, at Rabaul on New Ireland, at Ambon, and in the Solomon Islands. However, the attack on Pearl Harbor did not bring Yamamoto everything he had hoped for: the destruction of the main elements of the United States fleet. The aircraft carriers, which had been at sea, were undamaged and represented a constant threat. An impressive achievement was needed, and Yamamoto only expected the fall of Singapore in 5 or 6 months. It happened on February 15th. He believed that if he was to achieve his goal, to set the stage for negotiations, he needed to act in a different direction. But the question facing his planners was where to strike next. The Army vetoed Yamamoto's proposal to attack the Soviet Union. Such a war would be fought almost entirely on land, and the Army was heavily committed in China and Southeast Asia. Ultimately, 3 other ideas were proposed. Yamamoto's favorite option was an advance into the Indian Ocean, invading Ceylon, Sri Lanka, luring out and destroying the British Far East Fleet in a manner similar to how he had destroyed American ships at Pearl Harbor, and then pushing on to the Middle East to link up with the Germans who were advancing on the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. This way, the Japanese fleet would be assured of all the oil it needed. The Army refused to consider a Middle Eastern operation. Only 2 plans remained. One, proposed by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, called for an attack on Australia to deprive the Americans of this forward operating base. After the invasion of the Solomon Islands, the fleet was to seize New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Proponents of this plan in the Imperial General Headquarters were already preparing systems of occupation for Australia and New Zealand. However, Yamamoto did not like the Australia plan, as he considered it too protracted and not impressive enough to stop the Americans. Yamamoto also knew that the attack on Pearl Harbor had awakened a spirit of vengeance in people the Japanese were accustomed to despising as soft and incompetent. Too soft, as the Army put it, to fight a war to the end. It became clear that even the capture of Singapore would not stop the Americans. Yamamoto yearned for a victory that would allow Japan to extend a generous olive branch. In January, Yamamoto ordered a new plan to be developed, and 2 months later, he sent officers to Tokyo with a document called Plan Me, which envisioned a battle near Midway Atoll, where the American carrier force was to be destroyed. He also sent Plan AL to Tokyo, which detailed an invasion of the North American continent via Alaska. If all went according to plan, Hawaii would be occupied, and later perhaps the West Coast. At the very least, victories at Midway and in the Aleutian Islands would give the politicians a basis for negotiating the peace Yamamoto had hoped for. In Tokyo, the admirals debated at the conference table in the Navy Ministry, but Yamamoto eventually got his way. The potential significance of the fall of Singapore in February and the imminent collapse of Bataan and Corregidor, any of which could have served Yamamoto's purpose, was forgotten. The reason they ceased to be important was the April raid by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's squadron of B-25 bombers to Tokyo. The Doolittle raid shocked the Japanese, forcing them to realize that the Americans were just beginning to fight. In June, after the Midway operation turned into a catastrophe for Japan, there was no time for mutual recriminations. In fact, the Army was not even aware of the full extent of the defeat. The news of the destruction of 4 large aircraft carriers was carefully concealed and only known at the highest levels of the fleet. While Yamamoto was on his Midway expedition, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo was steadily advancing the fleet and its air arm south to prepare for the upcoming attempt to cut off Australia. Naval forces seized Rabaul on January 23rd, and from that point they conducted constant air reconnaissance and bombing of other islands and New Guinea,
It became clear to the Australians, who had informed General Douglas MacArthur of their fears after his arrival in March, that the Japanese would soon begin an offensive into New Guinea. If successful, it would be almost simple for the Japanese to capture northern Australia. The Japanese had already bombed Darwin in February, and in March, when they invaded Salamua on New Guinea, the pace was accelerating. In May, shortly before the Battle of Midway, the Japanese directed an invasion force toward Port Moresby, but they were repulsed by fierce American and Australian defense in the carrier battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese did occupy Tulagi, north of Guadalcanal, and began building a seaplane base there. Independent of Admiral Yamamoto, the Imperial General Headquarters planned an operation to seize Port Moresby, and Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayutake was ordered to advance on New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and be ready to resume the offensive against Port Moresby by July. This was to happen after the Battle of Midway, when Admiral Yamamoto was expected to return with his combined fleet. This large carrier force was presumed to provide protection for this new offensive. Despite the defeat at Midway, which the troops on the ground were told was a victory, the Imperial General Headquarters did not change its plans. A few days after Midway, the Australians informed General MacArthur that the Japanese were poised for an offensive. In light of the victory at Midway, MacArthur proposed that the Allies should launch a preemptive strike against the New Britain and New Ireland area, and then attack Rabaul, the main Japanese naval and air base in the region. With 2 carriers, 1,000 planes, and 1 amphibious division, MacArthur could push the Japanese back toward Truk. On June 12th, General Marshall proposed MacArthur's plan to Admiral King with some changes. He wanted 3 carriers instead of 2, plus 1 Marine division and 3 Army divisions for the attacks. Admiral King opposed the idea because it would give MacArthur command of the battle. King's additional arguments were that the carriers would be vulnerable to attack from shore-based aircraft, and they would have insufficient protection. As it turned out, the fleet would have to face both of these tactical problems at Guadalcanal. King developed his own plan, an offensive from the New Hebrides Islands with forces commanded by the fleet. MacArthur objected to his army forces serving under the fleet, but no one could deny the necessity of stopping the Japanese before they captured New Guinea and were ready to attack Australia. The problem for the Joint Chiefs of Staff was who would command the operation. The first phase, the main task of seizing the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions, they assigned to Admiral King. Guadalcanal was just a dot on the map with no known tactical or strategic value. It didn't even merit a name in this JCS plan. MacArthur was thrown a consolation prize. After the first phase, he was to assume command and mop up the Japanese on the rest of the Solomon Islands, Rabaul, and New Guinea. Admiral King got his way because the Joint Chiefs of Staff acknowledged that King had already planned a defensive line across the Pacific to protect Australia, and his plan required relatively fewer forces than MacArthur's. Thousands of servicemen were undergoing training in New Caledonia, and King persuaded General Arnold to send several squadrons of U.S. Army Air Force planes there. He reinforced Samoa and Ifate in the New Hebrides and was planning a base on Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose indecisiveness during the Wake Island crisis had displeased King, was reassigned to a newly created unit called the Amphibious Training Command in San Diego. He and Marine Major General Holland Smith were tasked with developing new methods for island warfare. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's planning chief, suggested that the first effort should be to hold the line in the South Pacific while simultaneously preparing amphibious forces. The second phase envisioned a combined offensive by the United States, Australia, and New Zealand across the Solomon Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. The third phase would involve the capture of the Caroline and Marshall Islands, and the fourth phase would lead the Allies either to the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines. Admiral King approved this plan. It was exactly what he envisioned, and he took steps to call for Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, who had been serving as a naval observer in London, to head the South Pacific Command. King removed Rear Admiral Turner from the planning division and ordered him to prepare to take command of the amphibious operation. All this was done before the Japanese attack on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley left Washington on May 1. He was to assume command of the South Pacific Forces on June 19. But first, he had to go to Pearl Harbor to report to Admiral Nimitz, who was his immediate superior. By the time Gormley reached Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive in the South Pacific was already beginning. On May 22, an Army plane spotted a Japanese photo reconnaissance aircraft photographing Guadalcanal. Army intelligence surmised that the Japanese were preparing to build an airfield there. On June 25, Army intelligence reported that the grass on the central plain of the island had been burned off and tents were pitched in the area. Pier construction was underway at Lunga. 6 days later, an Australian coast watcher on Guadalcanal reported that airfield construction was only awaiting the arrival of Japanese construction units. He even knew their names, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, which were the equivalent of American construction battalions. This information was confirmed by a radio intercept made by Nimitz's intelligence in Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's Radio Intelligence Group, which had broken parts of the Japanese naval code, intercepted a message stating that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive at their destination on July 4, and Fleet Intelligence put the facts together. Admiral Turner was visiting Pearl Harbor that day, on his way to prepare for an amphibious landing somewhere in the South Pacific. When Admiral Nimitz received the radio intelligence report, Admiral Turner knew where he was heading. It could only be the Solomon Islands. 2 weeks later, Turner was in Wellington, where he boarded his flagship, the USS Macaulay, a former Grace Line passenger ship, the Santa Barbara. His task was to prepare an entire amphibious task force in 1 month. While Turner was moving ships and men, Admiral Gormley was on his way to Melbourne for a meeting with General MacArthur. Gormley left New Zealand with his head full of gloomy thoughts about the futility of attempting to organize an amphibious operation when no one knew how to do it. MacArthur, who had his own reasons for disliking the plan, fully agreed with him. They also concurred that with the planes available, they could not guarantee the landing adequate air cover. After all, this meeting took place on July 18, and the landing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. They sent a dispatch to Washington recommending postponement of the operation, but King was not pleased with the message. King told his new commander that he was giving him a tough job and that he could not provide him with proper means until perhaps the fall. The answer was no. The invasion had to proceed as planned. Gormley left Washington convinced that the United States was not ready for aggressive action in the South Pacific. His despair deepened when he tried and failed to get construction battalions and other units immediately dispatched to New Zealand. From the beginning, the Guadalcanal invasion plan was marked by intelligence failures. All concerned commands knew that the operation was being prepared, especially after July 10, when Admiral Nimitz sent Admiral Gormley his combat orders. The main Japanese airbase was located in Rabaul. Planes from those airfields could stop at Guadalcanal, refuel, and then bomb Australia. There was no doubt they could inflict a fatal blow to the Allied buildup. But on July 10th, an Allied intelligence report that reached King contained only a casual remark about airfield construction on Guadalcanal, and a few days later, the report placed the field on the wrong side of the island.
By the end of July, the Japanese had completed the airfield, and at the combined fleet headquarters in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto gave the order that the first planned mission would leave Rabaul on August 14th. As the commander of the entire United States operation, Admiral Gormley was desperately trying to obtain more assistance to build forward bases, bring in more aircraft, but everywhere he turned, he learned the truth of Admiral King's statement that he could not provide Gormley with proper means. The supply of the invasion forces, for example, had been loaded chaotically onto transports in Auckland. There were plenty of docks there so the ships could be unloaded and reloaded with supplies in the order of their intended use. Instead, the ships were sent to Noumea, where no such facilities existed. Admiral King had at least a general idea of the difficulties, but there was no time for delay. King knew better than any of his subordinates the absolute necessity of stopping the Japanese before they reached Australia. The schedule remained the same. By the end of July, the rush was on, and 17,000 Marines were being ferried by transport ships from California, Pearl Harbor, Noumea, and Samoa. Admiral Gormley was too busy to hold a conference of his commanders, but on July 28th, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who was to exercise tactical command, called a meeting aboard his flagship carrier, the Saratoga. For the first time, the tactical unit commanders met to discuss the invasion. Admiral Fletcher was to cover the invasion with his task force. Admiral Turner was to deliver the troops of Marine General Alexander Vandegrift. Once the Marines had seized the island, garrison troops would be brought in, but the operation had been called so hastily that no one had provided for reserve troops. There were no more men in the South Pacific. The meeting on the Saratoga was a failure. Fletcher began by stating he would cover the landing on Guadalcanal for only 2 days. He insisted, and Gormley's staff members at the meeting agreed, that the carriers could not be risked. Fletcher was scared by previous incidents and declared the entire operation to be insane, rushed, and doomed. Admiral Turner, who understood the overall military picture better than any other man in that cabin that day, reproved his superior. He said there was no point in that kind of argument, and the decision to risk everything had been made. Their job was to carry out orders. Fletcher should have known all this since the Coral Sea. Admiral King was so displeased with Fletcher's constant reluctance to act that he insisted Admiral Nimitz ascertain Fletcher's morale. Nimitz was a kind man, and he liked Fletcher. He held an encouraging conversation with the carrier commander, and after the Battle of Midway had been won, Fletcher, who was in command there, could hardly be blamed. But on the eve of the first American offensive operation, to warn the troops and men on the support ships that he would leave them in 48 hours was the most inauspicious beginning. A rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion was held on July 28th and lasted 3 days. The location was Koro Island near Fiji. Only a third of the assigned troops were able to land ashore, and when they did, they didn't know what to do. General Vandegrift considered the training simulation a complete failure, but there was no time even for a review. On July 31st, the Marines were back aboard the transports and headed for Guadalcanal. In the afternoon of August 6th, as the 75-ship task force neared the Solomon Islands, Admiral Fletcher nervously detached himself with his carriers. He would provide air cover for the landing forces with his planes, as he had promised, but the 26 ships of the carrier task group were led as far away from danger as possible. If American intelligence was so wrong as to allow the Japanese to build an airfield on Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence was even more flawed, because as the American invasion fleet assembled in the South Pacific, the Japanese were completely unaware of the impending attack. In July 1942, the Japanese army was busy trying to seize New Guinea as a stepping stone for operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Tomaro Horii landed 2,000 troops of the South Seas Force near Buna. After the capture of Buna, the Japanese planned to build airfields there as a prelude to a new attack on Port Moresby.
Therefore, in July, Japanese air power was concentrated against Port Moresby. Bombers and fighters flew over the docks and airfields almost every day. Following the Japanese landings, the Japanese Air Force was also called upon to support the beachhead, and in the first days of August, their attention was focused on the new offensive. Joint Australian and American Air Forces replied with raids on the Japanese air bases at Lae. During this preparation, Yamamoto's flagship, the Yamato, was anchored at Hashima in Japanese waters. He was leisurely preparing for upcoming air operations over Australia and was about to see what action to take next. On August 3rd, the naval air groups based on Lae were returned to Rabaul to be ready for operations on Guadalcanal. which were scheduled to begin the following week. During the first week of August, the sky over the South Pacific was cloudy, and only a handful of Japanese reconnaissance planes took to the air. None of them detected the American armada heading for Guadalcanal. Japanese pilots flying from Rabaul were surprised to find American carrier planes in the sky around Buna. They had been told that the United States carriers had been destroyed at Midway. The pilots assumed that the carriers were operating in conjunction with Australian forces that had crossed the Owen Stanley Mountains. In fact, they were training for the Guadalcanal invasion. No one in the Imperial High Command or in the field had any suspicion of the impending invasion. After 8 months of continuous victories, it was difficult for the Japanese to believe that the Allies could launch a sea invasion. If the idea had been suggested, they would have agreed with General MacArthur and Admiral Gormley that such an invasion had little chance of success. Thus, as the American Expeditionary Force moved toward Guadalcanal, it enjoyed the element of surprise. On August 4th and 5th, the 75 ships sailed under overcast skies, and on August 6th, the fleet progressed through rain squalls for most of the day. But at dawn on August 7th, the sky cleared, which meant that the carrier planes would have good visibility for their attacks. The fleet went to general quarters at 5:30 a.m., and at 6 a.m., the carriers launched their first strike. Planes from the Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise were assigned targets on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavuta, and Tanambogo Islands. The Japanese had established a seaplane base on Gavuta and Tanambogo, which were connected by a causeway. Japanese planes had been grounded the day before due to bad weather. Admiral Fletcher's task force reported one unidentified plane during the day, but it was unclear whether it was Japanese or an aircraft from General MacArthur's command. In any case, the Japanese were not alerted until 6:12 a.m. when the communication staff at the seaplane base on Tulagi sent a frantic message announcing the attack. The radio message went to the 4th, 6th, and 8th Fleets, Admiral Yamamoto, and the Imperial General Headquarters. It was simple and concise. Heavy enemy shelling in progress. The weather cleared, and the carrier planes flew into scattered cumulus clouds in the light of a quarter moon. Fighters and bombers headed for their assigned missions. 8 fighters led by Lieutenant L. H. Bauer took off from the Enterprise to attack aircraft, torpedo boats, troop installations, and supply dumps on Guadalcanal. They found neither planes nor torpedo boats, but they strafed buildings at the Lunga Point airfield. Meanwhile, 8 more fighters from the Enterprise maintained a combat air patrol over the transports from 6 to 8 a.m. when they were relieved by others. Bombers began to strike Tulagi and the Lunga Point area, but no enemy air activity was sighted. All morning, the Americans owned the sky, and the only damaged aircraft were those that suffered from operational incidents. Planes from the other carriers struck the seaplane base on Gavuta. The surprise was complete. American planes arrived and began bombing and strafing seaplanes in the water. They destroyed 9 Zero-like float planes, 1 Kawanishi 4-engine flying boat, and 8 seaplanes used as scouts and bombers. Several Japanese pilots who tried to take off were shot down before they got airborne. No Japanese aircraft on Gavuta survived the attack.
Other carrier planes hit Japanese troop concentrations on Tulagi. Some struck the beaches, where the Marines were soon to invade. Before dawn, the Marines on the decks of the transports could see the high mountains of the island that was their target. The transport slipped through the narrow passage running between Guadalcanal and the Savo Islands into the Siwoka Strait. With the rising sun, the guns of the escorting warships opened fire, and flashes of light illuminated the fleet. There was virtually no return fire. Shelling from the cruisers and destroyers accompanying the troop transports set fires along the shore. An oil dump exploded, sending flames soaring into the sky. At 8 o'clock,
After 2 hours of bombing and shelling the island, the landing craft began to move toward the north shore, east of Lunga Point. The Marines were nervous. Neither they nor their officers had any practical experience in such a landing, as it was the first American amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War. At 9 o'clock, the troops were landing on Guadalcanal. They met no opposition because the Japanese had fled into the hills. The advance was ridiculously easy. The Marines quickly saw how completely they had surprised the enemy. They stumbled upon wooden barracks that had never been slept in. They found a tent with a dining table full of dishes and bowls of meat, rice, and boiled plums. Half-empty bowls of rice were scattered around, chopsticks hastily abandoned on the table or on the straw mats on the floor. The tents themselves told the story of why the Japanese had left so quickly. They were ripped by shrapnel fragments, and some had been knocked down by the naval gunfire prior to the landing. But any Marine who felt ready to celebrate the ease with which they had captured their early objectives was in for a shock. It was true that the Japanese were caught off guard on Guadalcanal, and they had not yet dug in and created permanent fortifications because most of these men were construction troops, not combatants. But on Tulagi, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marine Regiment faced stiff resistance. There were about 250 Japanese on this island. The Japanese were troops from the Yokohama Air Base Detachment under the command of Captain Hashiki Miyazaki. They were experienced and dedicated fighters. Edson's 1st Raiders were the toughest American troops in the Pacific. They were all volunteers, selected from the ranks of a force known for its fighting qualities. The concept of the Raider came from the recommendation of Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson to create a commando unit, and Carlson's experience included several months of service with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army in their guerrilla warfare against the Japanese in North China. Edson's Raiders had trained for many months in Spartan conditions, and when they arrived at Guadalcanal, they already had a formidable reputation. As it turned out, they would need every trick they had learned, and they would learn new ones. This invasion was the first contact between highly skilled American forces and seasoned Japanese veterans since the war began in December. The Japanese had gained a reputation even more formidable than that of the Raider battalions due to the phenomenally rapid advance of their forces through the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies. For months, Tokyo had trumpeted its victories, and half the world believed that the Japanese were invincible, a reputation the Imperial General Headquarters was happy to encourage. Tulagi, therefore, was in a sense the first testing ground. Edson's troops landed at 8:15 a.m. on the northwest part of the island, and at first the advance did not seem much more difficult than on Guadalcanal. They met some resistance from several outposts. The northwest part of Tulagi was covered in dense jungle, small trees, vines, and bougainvillea, with its beautiful leaves and sharp thorns. Initially, the terrain seemed the greatest obstacle. Edson lost only one man, and that to a sniper. As the Marines came ashore, Edson planned to move inland to the ridge that ran the length of the island, and then advance along the top of that ridge, clearing the slopes as they moved south. But the terrain was so difficult that it took the men 3 hours to cut their way through 1.5 miles of rising ground. Upon reaching the ridgeline, the Marines moved forward, emerged from the jungle, and ran straight into the central Japanese fortifications built on the hillside.
The Japanese had constructed dugouts and stone embrasures and had carefully positioned their machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire. The Japanese defense was based on holding the enemy below them, but the Marines found that by scrambling up the rocks, they could drop demolition charges and grenades into the pillboxes, and this was the method they had to use to advance. Once a pillbox was blown, it was still not safe. In one hole, the Americans killed 17 Japanese with dynamite charges. Epilogue. Thus began the great battle that forever changed the course of the Pacific War, proving that American troops were not only capable of fighting, but of winning in the harshest conditions. One Marine noticed a radio set inside a pillbox and entered to retrieve it. There were still 2 living Japanese soldiers inside, and they shot him, as well as another man who followed him before they were killed. One section of Marines engaged this defensive position in the center of the island, while the center and left flank of Edson's forces advanced along the ridge. But even along the ridge line, the going was not easy. One company suffered 15% casualties on that first day. Frontal resistance was stiff, but the Japanese frontal resistance was only half the battle. Snipers seemed to be everywhere, tied to trees, on top of buildings, behind rocks. A favorite sniper tactic was to let the forward element of a Marine unit pass and then start firing at the troops from the rear. This move almost always meant death for the sniper, but usually not before he inflicted a few casualties. And one thing the first raiders learned that day was that the small .25 caliber bullets of the Japanese rifles and machine guns were more apt to wound than to kill, which from the Japanese perspective was satisfactory because it required extra troops and resources to care for the wounded. Throughout the day, the raiders advanced along the ridge until they came upon a three-sided ravine, the bottom of which was an old British cricket field. The Japanese had dug in on the walls of the ravine and created sectors of fire that would become so familiar in the months ahead. When the Marines approached, they came under crossfire, and Edson halted because darkness was approaching, and it was no time to probe known dangers. That night, the Marines on Tulagi received another new experience. The Japanese, knowing they were outnumbered and had no chance of survival, staged one of those desperate counterattacks for which they would become infamously renowned. They waited until the Marine perimeter quieted down. Then, at 10:30 p.m., they broke through between two companies and surrounded one of them. The Marines fought in their foxholes and in the open, using rifles, machine guns, grenades, and knives. The Japanese moved along the ridge toward Colonel Edson's command post and reached a point 50 yards away from it. Finally, the Marines overwhelmed the Japanese and pushed them back, but not before one company lost half its non-commissioned officers. More troops were landed on Tulagi the next day, August 8th, until the total reached 7,500 on that side of the Siwoka Strait. Edson's raiders and the men of the 5th Battalion, 2nd Marine Regiment began moving again toward the southeast tip of the island. One by one, they assaulted the dug-in machine gun positions on the steep slopes of the old cricket field. From one cave, they extracted 35 dead Japanese, some of whom were already putrefying and smelled foul, but some had been killed in the last moment of the position's defense. From this, the Americans correctly deduced that the Japanese tactic was to hold a position to the last, if not ordered to retreat, a testament to the discipline of the Japanese armed forces. Those troops that surrendered on Guadalcanal were mostly members of labor battalions, not fighting units. The raiders on the second day encountered dozens of examples of a spirit they had not seen before. In one pillbox, they cornered 3 Japanese officers who only had one loaded pistol among them at the end. As the Marines were readying for the final assault, they heard 3 shots. When they entered the pillbox, they found 3 bodies and an empty pistol. One officer had fired all but the last 3 rounds and then shot his 2 comrades and himself.
In those early days, this suicidal attitude surprised the Marines. It was difficult for an American to understand how cornered or wounded soldiers, with no hope of survival in their hole, knowing the enemy had an enormous material and numerical advantage, almost invariably chose death instead of surrender. It took some time to get used to, but after several Japanese pretended to surrender, only to pull pistols or bayonets to attack their captors or detonate grenades to kill themselves and their enemies, the Marines accepted the Japanese on their own terms. After that, there were virtually no further attempts to persuade Japanese soldiers to surrender. Tulagi was secured on that second day, although not all Japanese on the island were killed. For days afterward, Japanese snipers harassed the American troops until the last sniper was killed. The ferocity of the fighting on Tulagi can be sensed in the example of Staff Sergeant Angus Goss. He went ahead of his men to assault a cave near the cricket field, The Japanese were sporadically firing from that position. He got close enough to throw hand grenades into the cave, and the Marines were trained to pull the safety pin of the egg-shaped grenade, throw, count slowly, and hear the explosion. Sergeant Goss pulled the pin, threw, and counted to 6. The grenade was thrown back out of the cave, and he had to dive to escape the explosion of his own weapon. After another identical occurrence, he held the grenade for 3 seconds, then threw 4, 5, 6, and it flew back out again. Sergeant Goss called for a satchel charge, a bag filled with dynamite usually used for blasting buildings. He stuck the charge, initiated it, and ran back a little. The Japanese pushed the charge out of the mouth of the cave. The dynamite exploded and drove a sliver of rock into Goss's leg. The wound was not serious enough to disable him, but painful enough to make him furious. He grabbed his submachine gun and rushed into the cave, spraying fire. He killed 4 Japanese soldiers and counted 8 others who had died earlier. If anything, the fighting on Gavuta and Tanambogo was worse than on Tulagi. The landing there took place in mid-morning. Few troops were involved because no one expected to find many Japanese there. But since the seaplane base was on these islands, the Japanese had fortified them, and the Marines ran into trouble. The Japanese were surprised and had not yet recovered from the bombing and air attack that had destroyed their seaplanes, so the first troops ashore were met only by rifle fire. But by the time the second wave of Marines reached the beach, the Japanese had organized about 500 yards inland, and the fire was intense. The third wave came under fire before the landing craft reached the shore, and casualties were heavy. Gavuta and Tanambogo were both dominated by small hills, no more than 150 feet high, but above sea level for a landing that height was enough. The Japanese had built their fortifications along the slopes, and they were well supplied with machine guns, automatic rifles, and ammunition. As on Tulagi, every Japanese position had to be taken. They would not retreat, and the brutality of the fighting on Tanambogo was almost unimaginable. In the early waves, the Marines landed tanks. The Japanese swarmed to the Tanambogo dock where the landing was taking place. They shoved crowbars under the treads, threw grenades, and tried to set the tanks on fire with gasoline-soaked rags. One tank commander opened the hatch and used the tank's machine gun to kill 23 Japanese soldiers before one climbed aboard the tank and bayoneted him. Another Japanese then threw gasoline-soaked rags inside the tank, and it burned. By mid-afternoon on that first day, it became apparent that the Marines might need reinforcements, and a unit that had landed earlier on Florida Island, where there were no Japanese, was called in to help. Tanambogo was taken, but the Marines could not secure the causeway that connected the 2 small islands. Reinforcements were ordered to Tanambogo, and at dusk they were given 5 minutes of preparatory naval bombardment.
Unfortunately, one of the last shells hit a fuel dump near the beach and lit up the shore as if it were noon. When the Marines approached, the Japanese clearly saw their silhouettes against the sea. A continuous stream of machine gun and rifle fire poured from the pillboxes on the hills. 2 boatloads of Marines reached the beach, but the coxswain of the third boat was killed at his helm, and the boat sheered off and headed back out to sea. Subsequent boats did the same, believing that some change in orders had occurred. Thus the men from 2 boats found themselves ashore, and their only protection was the concrete pier. The Japanese opened fire as soon as the Americans returned fire. The Japanese determined the position by the tracer bullets. Several men were soon wounded. One boat retreated, taking the wounded, and it took some time before the confusion was cleared up and other boats began landing. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched a counterattack on the beach. Captain Crane, the unit's commander, was cut off from his boat, and he and 5 men hid in the bushes, and in the darkness they escaped to return to the beach after the Japanese had retreated to their hillside positions. They were eventually evacuated, but it was 4 o'clock in the morning of August 8th before another unit landed and was able to secure the causeway. When the fighting began, there were 500 Japanese on the connecting islets of Gavuta and Tanambogo. When the fighting ended, there were none left. In the early morning of August 7, the Tulagi radio station transmitted the first word of the American assault to Rabaul.
The stunning news reached the Rabaul airfield just as the pilots for the early morning missions were preparing for takeoff for another day of harassing the Australians in New Guinea. The orders were immediately cancelled and all available planes were sent to strike the American invasion forces. Before the planes could take off, they received the unpleasant news from Tulagi. The entire seaplane flotilla had been destroyed. Then contact with Tulagi was broken, which could only mean one thing. The base there had been captured. At 8:30 a.m., a flight of 27 twin-engine Betty bombers took off from Rabaul. They were loaded to strike Australian forces in New Guinea, so they carried bombs instead of torpedoes. They were escorted by 108 fighters as they climbed to 13,000 feet, turned east toward Bougainville Island, and turned south along the Bougainville coast. They were discovered by 4 Enterprise planes just after 1 p.m. The Enterprise fighters were flying at 18,000 feet when they sighted a large formation of Betty bombers below, escorted by Zeros just above Florida Island. The F-4Fs attacked, and Lieutenant Dice shot down 1 bomber. 4 others were smoked and were credited as probables, but after this first pass, the Zeros engaged and the F-4Fs withdrew to take cover in the clouds as they had been ordered. They suffered heavy losses. 1 F-4F was shot down, and Lieutenant Dice's plane was so badly shot up that he had to crash land on the Wasp. Lieutenant G.E. Firebaugh led another flight of 6 fighters from the Enterprise, and they found the enemy off Santa Isabel Island. 10 Zeros quickly approached and attacked 3 of the fighters. All 3 F-4Fs were shot down. The remaining 3 American fighters attacked the bombers, and Ensign R.N. Dice shot down 1 Betty. The first Zero kill was credited to aviation radioman T.W. Rhodes, but the Zeros descended on them in large numbers, and the F-4Fs dived into the clouds to hide. 10 Zeros pursued them in 2 formations, and they closed in, adhering to the Japanese rule, never lose sight of your wingman. They attacked the F-4Fs from the starboard side, and Lieutenant Firebaugh, as well as enlisted pilot W.C. Stevenson, Jr., and aviation machinist's mate W.H. Warden were shot down. One of the coast watchers picked Firebaugh out of the water off Santa Isabel Island. The Guadalcanal coast watcher sent a canoe to rescue Warden from the same island. But Stevenson was not found. On the other carriers, the story was much the same. The bombers were much easier targets. 6 fighters of Squadron 323 encountered the enemy bombers off Lunga Point and shot down 4 of them. Machinist D.E. Runyon destroyed 2 single-handedly. Just after 2:30 p.m., as the Japanese Betty bombers and Zero fighters began their approach over the islands, the coast watchers were on the alert. Paul Edward Mason, a copra planter in peacetime, was on Malab Hill on Bougainville watching Buin. At 9 a.m., he sent a message that 24 Japanese bombers were heading for Guadalcanal. They were still 400 miles or 2¼ hours from the target when this message was relayed back from Pearl Harbor to the fleet. This message reached the invasion fleet with plenty of time to prepare.
The reaction of the HMAS Canberra, one of the Australian cruisers, was typical. When the word came, the bosun announced the message. Ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo planes. All hands will eat lunch at 11 o'clock. And the torpedo planes arrived right on schedule. The American fighters climbed above them to 20,000 feet. When the bombers reached the northern shore of Guadalcanal and sighted the invasion fleet below, the American carrier fighters and the ship's guns were ready for them. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese were feeling the results of a counterattack. The American fighters were quite effective against the twin-engine bombers. Of the 24 Beatties that eventually arrived over Guadalcanal, all but 1 were shot down, and the only damage suffered in this first attack was to the destroyer Mugford, which was hit by a bomb. With the Zero fighters, however, the story was different. Pilot Saburo Sakai, the leading Japanese ace, was among the 18 chosen for their skill to make this first long-range mission over the target. The Japanese group was attacked by F-4F Wildcat fighters from the carriers, and they headed directly for the bombers, ignoring the Zeros. The Zeros defended the bombers as best they could, but then turned toward the American fighters. Sakai was puzzled by the American tactics. The fleet pilots dived against the Zeros, But if they missed on the first pass, they scattered and evaded. They had been well instructed by their intelligence, which knew that the Zero was superior in turning ability and rate of climb, and was faster. After a grim and skillful fight, Sakai shot down one F-4F and one SBD dive bomber that was attacking 4 Zeros alone. Several other Japanese pilots made kills, while 1 Zero was lost. Pilot Sakai attacked a group of SBD torpedo planes, believing they were fighters, and ran straight into 4 firing machine guns operated by rear gunners who held him in their sights as he approached. His Zero was badly shot up and he was seriously wounded, yet he managed to fly the plane back to Rabaul and landed before losing consciousness. In the air, the Japanese still had a temporary advantage in the quality of the Zero, but the Americans in their F-4Fs were already beginning to learn to use the enemy's limitations to their advantage. The issue of air control would obviously be hotly contested. At this particular moment, the Americans had the advantage of proximity with the carriers near shore, but the Japanese had the advantage of numbers at Rabaul, and the American effort was severely hampered by the superiority of the Japanese Zeros over the American fighters. The carrier pilots were flying the F-4F Wildcat, which was not as fast or maneuverable as the Zero, and the Japanese could outfly them. The only advantage of the F-4F was its sturdy construction and armor protection, all that was necessary to keep the ratio of lost planes as low as it was for the Americans. At Rabaul, the Japanese quickly recovered from the surprise of the American invasion, but the problem for the Japanese fighters was the 1,100-mile round trip. For this reason, on the first day, Commander Nakajima, the fighter squadron leader, resisted the demands of the High Command to send all available Zeros into battle, and sent only his most experienced pilots. He soon had to send others, and the losses were becoming increasingly severe, mostly due to the vast distances that had to be covered. By the night of the first day, the United States invasion seemed secure. The American forces had advanced close to the airfield and met no substantial resistance. One prisoner was captured, and he indicated that there were only about 600 combat troops and 1,400 laborers on the island, and that they had fled to the opposite side. Admiral Turner had put 11,000 Marines ashore, and huge piles of ammunition, food, and other supplies cluttered the beaches.
General Vandegrift noted that the shore party could not handle the flow of supplies, but fearing that the carriers would soon leave, he was glad to see the supplies still coming in. He established a second beachhead, but it was soon as badly jammed as the first. At 8:40 a.m. on August 8th, Coast Watcher Jack Reed in the Buka Passage sighted 45 Japanese dive bombers that had taken off from Kevyang 30 minutes earlier. Pearl Harbor relayed the broadcast to the ships half an hour later. Carrier planes attacked and destroyed many of the enemy bombers, but the United States ships did not escape loss that day. A flaming bomber plunged into the deck of the transport George F. Elliott and set it on fire. One dive bomber sent a torpedo into the destroyer Jarvis, disabling it. That morning, the planes of the Enterprise and other carriers flew their missions and found clear skies. They strafed and bombed troop concentrations along the Tanaru River and worked over the airfield again. At about 10 o'clock, 3 fighters from the Enterprise spotted a group of Japanese torpedo planes coming in low over the water to attack the transports. The Americans swept down on them. Machinist Runyon shot down 1 bomber and 1 fighter. Ensign VHH Rouse shot down 2 twin-engine torpedo planes, and Ensign J.D. Shoemaker shot down another. That was the end of the air activity for the entire day. By night, the 6th fighter flight of the Enterprise tallied its losses, 6 pilots shot down by Zeros. Japanese Zero fighters still had the advantage in experience in aircraft, but American pilots were already beginning to learn the tricks of the trade. The Enterprise Air Group commander concluded that the Zero had 2 major drawbacks: limited firepower and inability to withstand punishment. Because of the Zero's superior rate of climb, maneuverability, and fuel capacity, the F-4F pilots were warned to stick close together, and when attacking, each 2-plane element was to establish a scissors, constantly turning toward each other. This way, a pair of F-4Fs could concentrate their superior firepower on the enemy, while they knew their own planes could absorb a tremendous amount of damage.
On the ground, the Marines were fighting fierce Japanese resistance on Tulagi, Gavuta, and Tanambogo. On Tulagi, they suffered 90 casualties but took control of the island by the end of the second day. The Japanese garrison of 250 men fought to the end. 200 men were killed, 3 surrendered, and the rest swam the strait to Florida Island to continue the fight. On Gavuta and Tanambogo, the Marines suffered 250 casualties. The Japanese garrison of 500 men was wiped out to the last man. The ferocity of this fighting on Tulagi contrasted sharply with the easy going of the Marines on Guadalcanal. There, on the morning of August 8th, the Marines reached the edge of the airfield they would name Henderson Field in honor of the aviator who died at Midway. They were beginning to develop contempt for the enemy. "I wish these Japanese would come out and fight," one Marine remarked within earshot of Richard Tregaskis, the International News Service correspondent who was accompanying the invasion. "All they do is run into the jungle." On the surface, the Marines could not have wished for a better war. But the officers were on edge that afternoon. It was too easy. At sea, the Americans apparently had no resistance either. A few Japanese patrol boats and tenders and 1 or 2 transports were caught offshore, and they were destroyed in the first hours of the invasion by shelling and bombing. Only in the air were the Japanese giving the Americans a pause. Most of those first waves of bombers had been destroyed, but the cost of meeting the Zeros was 21 out of Admiral Fletcher's 99 carrier planes. This loss, not high by operational standards, convinced Fletcher that his decision to retreat was sound. At 6 o'clock that evening, Fletcher asked Admiral Gormley for permission to withdraw his carriers. He retreated before he received an answer. When Admiral Turner intercepted Fletcher's dispatch, he realized that the withdrawal of the carriers would leave him without any air cover. The number of Japanese planes was expected to rise sharply as the enemy brought more planes through the island chain.
As Fletcher began his withdrawal, the Japanese were moving in force. When the word invasion was relayed from Guadalcanal to Rabaul, Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa reacted immediately. Admiral Mikawa was the commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet in the Outer South Seas Force, which meant he was responsible for the entire South Pacific operation. His first step was to load 6 small transports with troops and send them escorted by a destroyer to reinforce the 2,000-man Guadalcanal garrison. But the convoy ran into the American submarine S-38, which was operating out of Australia after the fall of the Philippines. The S-38 sank the transport Meo Maru with 342 men aboard. The sinking, coupled with reports of the gigantic American invasion flotilla, convinced the admiral that it was too dangerous to attempt to reinforce the garrison at the moment, and he recalled the 5 other transports. By that time, Japanese naval assistance was already on its way to Guadalcanal. Admiral Mikawa was lucky in the matter of timing. In the early morning of August 7th, as the Tulagi garrison sent its last message, 5 heavy cruisers had left Cavite at the northern tip of New Ireland. 3 of them were heading northeast toward Manus Island in the Admiralty Group, and 2 were steering for Rabaul. Admiral Mikawa soon ordered all 5 cruisers to hurry to Rabaul. Shortly after noon, the cruiser Sakai, escorted by a destroyer, steamed into Simpson Harbor. 4 other cruisers waited in the St. George Channel between New Ireland and New Britain for the Sakai to join them. When she arrived late in the evening, she was carrying Admiral Mikawa himself and was accompanied by the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari. Thus, the Japanese were moving toward Guadalcanal with 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 1 destroyer. As they sped south, Admiral Mikawa was formulating his battle plan. By reducing speed, they could delay their arrival until after midnight on August 8th and stage a surprise night attack on the American forces at the beachhead. The admiral knew that the Americans had several carriers in the area while he had none. A night attack was a guarantee that he would not be pursued by American planes, as the Americans had no recorded data of night air operational skill. In fact, the Americans had no recorded data of competence in night naval operations of any kind, while this aspect of tactics had become a Japanese specialty. Mikawa's problem that afternoon was how to approach Guadalcanal without arriving too early and without giving away the element of surprise. He had to attack to support the defenders of Guadalcanal, but if he could surprise the enemy, the effectiveness would be enormous. The admiral did not know it right now, but the nature of the divided command, the inadequacy of the American air intelligence system, and the lack of clearly defined search methods would all play directly into his hands. For intelligence on Japanese ship movements, the Americans at Guadalcanal had to rely only on air search and submarine reports. Only under the most special circumstances would Coast Watcher reports be very useful regarding naval vessel operations.
In the early morning, the cruisers were sighted by American B-17 Army bombers as they moved down toward Rabaul. On the evening of August 7th, Mikawa's force was sighted by the S-38 just as they were emerging from St. George Channel. That night, the commander of the S-38 reported the contact to Brisbane, but little credence was given to these two reports by American naval commanders because Rabaul had become the forward base of the Japanese fleet, and it was quite normal for ships to be entering and exiting. The Americans did not see any indication that the ships in question were heading for Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley was responsible for coordinating all elements of the American attack, but to provide air search he had to rely on several sources.
First, there were the long-range B-17 bombers of General MacArthur's American Air Force and the Australian Army Air Force, part of MacArthur's command, which operated independently. Second, there were the shore-based naval air forces of Admiral McCain, which included a number of seaplane tenders and PBY patrol bombers. General MacArthur's planes were to take responsibility for the search in the Bismarck Islands, concentrating on the great naval and air base at Rabaul. McCain was to watch the northern approaches to the region, which meant Truk and the Marshall Islands. Admiral Fletcher's carrier planes were to conduct short-range searches, but actually conducted none at all. Fletcher was preoccupied with his anxieties. Admiral Turner looked at his charts and saw that the Japanese had a perfect approach to Guadalcanal Island along the western coast of Bougainville, straight down between Choiseul and Vela Islands, past Columbangara, between New Georgia and Santa Isabel, and then between Florida Island and the north coast of Guadalcanal. This corridor was named the Slot. It would soon become infamous in American naval history. On the morning of August 8, 4 PBYs were scheduled to fly from Nandi on a 700-mile triangular route, the apex of which was the Fiji Islands. They would approach almost due west of Santa Cruz Island. 6 PBYs were to fly search patterns from Espiritu Santo to the northeast over the Santa Cruz Islands and terminate at a point just above the Bismarcks, but far west of the Japanese task force. 6 PBYs were to disperse from Mala through the Slot from Guadalcanal to search the area north and west of the Slot. 3 B-17s were to conduct a search north of Guadalcanal. On the night of August 7, as Admiral Turner examined the search plan for the next day, he found that the Slot was completely uncovered. He requested Admiral McCain for a special search there the next day, but somehow between Admiral Turner's flagship, Admiral McCain's headquarters, and the Mackinac seaplane tender at Mala, the message was lost. The search was never made. Thus, on August 8, the Americans left the most obvious approach of any enemy naval force to Guadalcanal uncovered.